A family walks into a grocery store with the same paycheck they earned last year and the same shopping list. Bread, cereal, detergent, medicine, vegetables, diapers, and if the budget allows, a little meat. There's nothing extravagant in the cart. Nothing has dramatically changed. But when the cashier reads the total, the number is higher again. The family may never know why. The fertilizer used to grow the wheat became more expensive months ago. The plastic wrapping the bread came from a petrochemical supply chain that was disrupted thousands of miles away. Diesel raised the cost of moving food from the farm to the warehouse, from the warehouse to the store. Shipping insurance climbed because a strategic waterway became dangerous. The retailer paid more to finance its inventory. Each increase was small enough to vanish inside the system. Together, they took another piece of the paycheck. Globalization made prices feel local. Its unraveling reveals how global they always were. For decades, globalization operated like an invisible discount on Western life. Companies could manufacture their products wherever labor, land, energy, and materials were cheapest, then ship those products across oceans at an extraordinary scale. A shirt could be designed in Europe and stitched in Bangladesh, dyed with chemicals from China, carried on a vessel registered in one country but owned by another, then sold in a shopping mall in Canada or America. The consumer saw only the final product and the price. And for a long time, the price kept falling. Televisions grew larger and became cheaper. Computers became more powerful and more affordable. Clothing became so inexpensive that people could treat it as disposable. Furniture, toys, appliances, phones, tools, and household goods that once required months of saving became ordinary purchases. Even when wages didn't rise quickly, cheaper manufactured goods made the paycheck feel bigger. This benefit was real. Globalization raised living standards for millions of consumers. It gave households access to products that previous generations would have considered luxuries. It helped developing economies build factories, create jobs, and enter world markets. It allowed companies to tap into specialized skills and resources from every corner of the planet. But this discount had terms and conditions that never appeared on the receipt. Fuel had to remain affordable. Ships had to reach their ports on time. Ports had to stay open. Supplier countries had to keep exporting. Trade relationships had to remain stable. Currencies had to hold their value. Sea lanes had to stay secure. Companies had to trust that today's cheapest factory would still be there tomorrow. The product looked cheap because peace, energy, shipping, and political cooperation were included for free. A generation grew up believing these prices were normal. They were not. They were the product of a very specific global order, built during an extraordinarily cooperative period of economic history. That order could withstand individual recessions, regional wars, and political disagreements because the larger machine kept running. Then the shocks started coming faster. The pandemic arrived and factories and ports were shut down. A container ship blocked the Suez Canal. Semiconductor shortages delayed automobiles and electronics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine rattled energy, grain, and fertilizer markets. Trade conflicts brought tariffs and export restrictions. Attacks on shipping pushed vessels onto longer routes. Then the Iran war turned the Strait of Hormuz into the most dangerous pressure point in the global economy. For roughly 4 months, a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman became a worldwide bottleneck for energy, agriculture, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and transportation. The strait normally carries a large share of globally traded oil, so petroleum received the most attention. Oil prices reacted immediately. Traders watched tankers, military movements, ceasefire talks, and government reserves. But oil was only the first layer. The region also supplied liquefied natural gas, fertilizer, sulfur, helium, refined fuels, liquefied petroleum gas, and petrochemical feedstocks. These were not obscure industrial commodities with no connection to daily life. They were hidden inside daily life. Fertilizer is buried in the price of bread, cereal, vegetables, cooking oil, meat, eggs, and dairy. Petrochemicals appear in food packaging, detergent bottles, clothing, furniture foam, carpets, paint, insulation, electronics, car parts, and construction materials. Helium is essential for MRI machines, semiconductor manufacturing, fiber optics, scientific equipment, and aerospace. The most important shortage may be in something you have never personally purchased. This is how a global shock reaches the household. It rarely travels in a straight line. It moves in layers. A shipping route becomes dangerous. Insurance companies charge more to cover the voyage. Tankers and cargo ships wait, take longer routes, or stop moving altogether. Fuel costs rise. Importers pay more. Factories pay more for materials. Farmers pay more for fertilizer. Manufacturers pay more for components and packaging. Wholesalers raise their prices. Retailers reduce discounts, shrink packages, change ingredients, or raise the final price. By the time the bill reaches the consumer, the original cause is nearly invisible. Inflation doesn't arrive at the checkout as a single dramatic event. It arrives as thousands of companies quietly passing the bill to the next one in line. This is why the apparent end of a crisis can be misleading. Oil prices can fall quickly because financial markets react to new information instantly. A peace deal is announced. Tanker traffic begins to recover. Producers increase output. Traders decide the worst-case scenario has become less likely and prices drop. Television says the crisis is easing, but farms and factories don't operate at the speed of financial markets. A farmer buys fertilizer before planting. If fertilizer is unavailable or too expensive, the farmer may use less, reduce the area planted, switch crops, or accept the higher cost. The harvest comes months later. The grain then turns into flour, animal feed, cooking oil, meat, dairy, and processed food. The disruption may have ended before its full impact reaches the supermarket. The oil market reacts today. The food market reacts next season. You don't eat fertilizer, but fertilizer is embedded in the price of almost everything you eat. The same delay applies to petrochemicals. A packaging company may already have several months of inventory. An automaker may have stocks of plastic and industrial chemicals on hand. A hospital may have secured helium through a prior contract. For a while, the system looks normal because companies are consuming what they already have. Then contracts come up for renewal. Inventories thin out. New shipments arrive at higher prices. Costs are carried into the next production cycle. The headline shock can end before the household shock begins. And sometimes the bill doesn't appear as an obvious price increase. Companies have several ways to make the consumer pay. They can raise the sticker price. They can shrink the package. They can lower the quality. They can remove features, shorten warranties, introduce new fees, reduce service, or eliminate promotions. A cereal box stays the same height, but becomes narrower. A detergent bottle contains fewer washes. A restaurant keeps the price the same, but reduces the portion. An airline separates a service from the ticket and sells it back as a fee. A manufacturer replaces a durable component with a cheaper one. The bill doesn't always come as a higher number. Sometimes you simply get less for the same price. This matters because the era of globalization did something beyond lowering prices. It trained consumers to expect perpetual abundance. Stores carried enormous product ranges. Delivery grew faster. Inventory seemed infinite. If one brand was unavailable, another appeared immediately. Households stopped thinking about where goods came from because the system worked well enough to become invisible. But that abundance was built on concentrated supply. The world did not maintain 5 interchangeable sources for every critical material. Companies typically chose the cheapest and most efficient supplier. They reduced inventories because stored goods tied up capital. They eliminated spare capacity because redundancy looked like waste. They built production around the assumption that parts would arrive exactly when needed. This system made products cheaper in normal times. It made normal times more important than anyone wanted to admit. When the system breaks, rebuilding resilience is not free. Producing goods domestically can require higher wages, more expensive land, stronger environmental regulations, larger inventories, backup factories, and additional suppliers. Governments may subsidize new facilities, protect strategic sectors, or pay companies to maintain spare capacity. These costs show up somewhere. They can show up in taxes. They can show up in public debt. They can show up in higher product prices. They can show up in lower corporate profits. Usually, they show up in a combination of all 4. The old system made products cheaper by hiding fragility. The new system may make products safer by making costs visible. This is where political promises become dangerous. Leaders can say they will bring factories home, punish foreign producers, and make the country self-reliant again. But a tariff does not build a factory. It makes the imported product more expensive. A factory requires engineers, skilled workers, electricity, suppliers, machinery, transportation networks, financing, and years of accumulated knowledge. Tariffs can sometimes be useful for protecting strategic sectors, but in the short term, they generally raise the cost of imported goods and components. A company facing a new tariff may absorb part of the cost, but profit margins are not infinite. Eventually, some of the bill reaches the consumer. You cannot rebuild industrial resilience overnight, but you can make imports more expensive overnight. This creates a painful transition. The cheap system becomes less reliable before the replacement system becomes productive. Households may face higher prices from both the global disruption and the effort to reduce dependence at the same time. Then interest rates enter the picture. A supply disruption pushes up energy, food, transportation, and goods costs. Central banks worry that higher prices will spread through the economy. They delay rate cuts or keep rates higher for longer. The goal is to prevent inflation from becoming entrenched. But higher interest rates do not produce fertilizer. They do not open shipping lanes. They do not repair refineries or create helium. They reduce demand by making borrowing more expensive. Now the people in the household pay twice. First, the disruption raises prices at the grocery store, the fuel pump, the transit fare, and the home goods aisle. Then the response to the disruption raises the cost of a mortgage, rental financing, a credit card balance, a car loan, and business borrowing. First, the crisis raises the bill. Then the fight against the crisis raises the interest on the money needed to pay the bill. This is why global supply shocks feel so ruthless. Households don't just pay more at the store. They may also pay more to finance a home, replace a car, carry a credit card balance, or keep a small business afloat. And the pain does not distribute equally. A wealthy household can postpone a vacation, delay a luxury purchase, absorb a higher energy bill, or draw from savings. A lower-income household spends a larger share of its income on food, shelter, utilities, transportation, and basic goods. These expenses are not easily deferred. The household cannot negotiate with hunger, with winter, with the landlord, or with the commute. When food inflation rises, everyone pays more. But the family already spending most of its paycheck on necessities loses something deeper: the freedom to choose. This is why falling inflation doesn't feel like relief. Inflation measures how fast prices are rising. If food prices jump from $100 to $120, then rise more slowly to $122, inflation has fallen. The bill has not. Falling inflation does not mean falling prices. It means prices are rising more slowly from an already painful level. In advanced economies, even after the inflation rate began to soften, food and energy costs remained dramatically above pre-pandemic levels. The household didn't return to the old price. It simply stopped moving away from that price as fast. The cost of living crisis doesn't disappear when the graph improves. It stays inside the monthly budget. This is the deeper danger of the end of cheap globalization. For decades, low-priced imported goods partially offset weak wage growth. A worker might not receive a significant raise, but televisions, clothing, electronics, and household items became cheaper or better. Globalization stretched purchasing power without increasing income itself. If that discount fades while wages remain under pressure, households lose from both directions. Their pay doesn't rise enough, and the products that made their pay feel bigger become more expensive. The era of cheap imports helped disguise the weakness of the wage economy. That protection is now thinning. This doesn't mean globalization is over. Goods will continue to cross borders. Companies will continue to source internationally. Countries will still specialize, trade, and depend on one another. The world is not returning to full national self-sufficiency because full self-sufficiency would be inefficient, expensive, and in most cases impossible. What is changing is the shape of globalization. Supply chains will become more political. Companies will source more from allied nations. Governments will subsidize strategic sectors. Firms will hold more inventory. Production will be duplicated across regions. Tariffs and export controls will become more common. Energy, minerals, food, technology, and transportation will increasingly be treated as instruments of national power. The world may remain globalized, but it will be less optimized, more redundant, more political, and more expensive. Globalization isn't disappearing. It's losing its innocence. For years, Ordinary people were told that the low price on the shelf was proof of efficiency. But that price didn't include the cost of rebuilding a factory after it vanished. It didn't include the cost of defending a shipping lane. It didn't include the cost of a strategic reserve needed when the oil stopped flowing. It didn't include the risk of depending on a single country for a critical medicine or industrial material. It didn't include the environmental strain, low wages, or political instability elsewhere in the supply chain. The price was real. It was just incomplete. Now those missing costs are returning through higher prices, taxes, subsidies, shortages, public debt, and interest rates. Because they arrive separately, people may not recognize them as parts of the same bill. A food price increase seems unrelated to a naval conflict. A higher mortgage rate seems unrelated to a fertilizer shortage. A smaller bottle of detergent seems unrelated to a disruption in natural gas production. A government subsidy for a semiconductor plant seems unrelated to the price of a phone. But they all belong to the same story. For decades, globalization made ordinary people feel wealthier by lowering the price of the things they bought. That bargain depended on cheap energy, cheap shipping, concentrated production, open trade routes, and a world stable enough to keep everything moving. These conditions were never guaranteed. They were simply treated as permanent. Now the disruptions are arriving faster, the buffers are growing thinner, and the costs are traveling from distant factories, farms, ports, and shipping lanes into the household budget. The cheap era didn't end because the world ran out of products to consume. It ended because the hidden conditions behind the price finally became visible. And when the bill arrives, it doesn't go to the corporation that designed the system. It goes to the person standing at the checkout, wondering why the same basket costs more again. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.